Hello and welcome back to the Political Circus Weekly podcast. I am your host, Mike-Ursery, and you are listening to episode number 16. The Political Circus Weekly podcast is a part of the Think Liberty Network. You can also find our other shows on the Think Liberty Network, the Think Liberty podcast, Magi, Liberty Bites, and Coffee Shop Philosophy. You can find the Think Liberty Network at most places where podcasts are hosted, to include iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, and Google Play. So here we are in the month of February, and one of the days of this month is known as Groundhog Day. It's on February 2nd. Yes, it's the day when a small furry animal predicts how much longer we will have winter. Either it sees its shadow and we have 6 more weeks, because the shadow of a groundhog apparently is the best thing to use when exploring weather patterns. If he doesn't see his shadow, he stays outside, and that means we'll have an early spring. Again, understanding weather patterns is in the shadow of the groundhog. But I kind of have a different opinion of what the whole thing is with the groundhog's shadow. I don't think that it's so much that the groundhog is afraid of his shadow. I think maybe he looks into his shadow and he sees everything associated with winter. He sees all the snow, the ice, the freezing wind, the cold temperatures, gray skies, so much cold and gloom, and he is just disgusted by it. And he says, "I'm going back in my hole. Let me know when it's spring." And you know what? I am on a level with that groundhog. I am completely on a level with that groundhog because I am also over winter. Let me know when spring arrives, because I've had it with winter. You might remember the movie Groundhog Day, the comedy starring Bill Murray. He plays a TV news reporter who goes to Punxsutawney in Pennsylvania to cover Groundhog Day, and he ends up getting stuck in the same day for several days. He wakes up every morning to find out that it's Groundhog Day again. We avoided a variation of Groundhog Day this week, and what I mean by that is we were wondering if the government would partially shut down over the dispute of President Donald Trump's border wall. Again, it happened back in December, just before Christmas. There are some parts of the government that still were not funded. One of them was the Department of Homeland Security, and the whole standoff was over Donald Trump getting the funding that he wanted to complete the border wall, which the Democrats in the House of Representatives are not willing to give him. And the government shut down as a result, and it stayed shut down for 35 days, setting a new record as the longest government shutdown in history. Well, back in January, they filed a continuing resolution to end that government shutdown. And it gave them 3 weeks, which would have taken them to the end of February 15th, this past Friday, gave them 3 weeks to come together and compromise on a spending bill and keep these parts of the government open and avoid another shutdown. And we were all thinking that they would not find a way to keep the government open, and they would have another government shutdown, and who knows how long that would have gone on for. Well, it turns out that they made the agreement, and the government is going to stay open, but it comes at a cost. And I am not just talking about the spending that is in this bill. What all is in this bill? Well, we do know that Donald Trump is getting $1.4 billion for the wall, but we don't really know many other details about it. I don't know a lot of details about it because I really haven't had a chance to look at it yet. But what I do know is that this bill is 1,100 pages. It was completed late Wednesday night, voted on Thursday, and the president signed it Friday. You're going to try to tell me that everyone in Congress read a bill that is 1,100 pages. Every person understands all of it. They understand everything that's in it, and they know exactly what they're voting on. I refuse to believe that. I do not think that is possible. But first, let's talk about what was announced before the bill was voted on in the Senate. Before the vote on the Senate floor, Mitch McConnell announced that the president would sign the bill and then he would declare a national emergency on the southern border. He's doing this so he can obtain the necessary funding for the border wall. He didn't get what he asked for from Congress. Now he's taking matters into his own hands. President Trump said he was going to. Now, he said that he was going to do this. He said this a while back that he was going to do this if he did not get what he wanted. And now this has become a reality. We are treading into dangerous water with this. People who support Donald Trump are going to approve of this because one of the reasons that they voted for him was because of his stance on immigration and border security. You remember his rallies leading up to the election in 2016, so many chants of build the wall at his rallies. Well, now he's in year 3 of his term, and the wall has not been completed. Parts of the border have barriers, but not across the entire border. On February 15th, President Trump announced that he would declare a national emergency and use as much as $8 billion to complete the border wall. And we all should be worried by this. Everyone should be worried by this. A sitting president without Congress is appropriating funds for something that he wants. Presidents declaring national emergencies is nothing new. It's been happening since the National Emergencies Act was passed during the Carter administration. But in this instance, we have a national emergency declared after Congress said no to funding requested by the executive. The president is now bypassing Congress by declaring a national emergency and transferring funds to pay for the border wall. The term, ever since Mitch McConnell made this announcement that President Trump would declare a national emergency, the term unprecedented has been getting thrown around. Now, the very act of a president declaring a national emergency is not unprecedented, but the manner and the details behind the reason why President Trump is declaring a national emergency is, in my opinion. He isn't being given what he wants, so he's resorting to other means to get his wall funding. In my opinion, that is unprecedented, and Trump is setting up the GOP for severe consequences in the future. We won't always have a Republican president in the White House. We won't always have a Republican Senate Majority Leader who supports that Republican president's agenda. At some point, sooner or later, we will have a Democratic president in the White House, and we will have a Democratic-controlled Senate. And if that Democratic president can't get what they want from a Republican-controlled House of Representatives, that Democratic president would declare a national emergency. You already have Democrats who are declaring that they will run for president. Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren, and several others are expected to declare later on. What are the 3 main items that are going to be on the Democrat platform in 2020? Climate change, healthcare, and gun violence. Let's imagine for a moment that President Kamala Harris is in the White House. And no, I don't think Harris is going to be in the White House. I don't think she'll even win the nomination. This is just a hypothetical for this scenario. Let's imagine if Harris is asking for climate change legislation. She wants some of the things that are laid out in the Green New Deal. And oh, by the way, she has endorsed the Green New Deal. She goes to Congress and asks for the funding necessary to obtain what she wants. Congress tells her no, they won't give her the funding she wants. Harris declares a national emergency, saying that climate change is a grave threat to our existence, and she is now unilaterally transferring funds to pay for her climate change policies. With Trump doing this for his border wall, he is opening a door to make this possible for future presidents. Plus, we already have Democrats in Congress rallying for something like this. Ilhan Omar, representing Minnesota's 5th District, tweeted on Friday that a Democratic president should do this on day 1 of their term, and she's talking about climate change. So one question that has been presented ever since Trump made this declaration is if what he is doing is legal. And the answer to that is yes. Under the National Emergencies Act, he can do this. Which brings up a follow-up question. Should the president be able to wield so much power? Well, it's too late for that question. We're here now. And past presidents have expanded the power of the executive so much that, and the legislative sitting back and allowing it to happen, has gotten us to where we are now. And you know what? That is definitely going to happen. What I was just talking about is definitely going to happen. A Democrat might not win in 2020. A Democrat could very well win in 2024. At some point, Green New Deal legislation will get forced into law some way, somehow, and it's going to be executive overreach that makes it happen. The next question to ask is if Congress can stop the president from declaring a national emergency. And the answer to that is yes and no. Like right now, Trump can declare a national emergency and Congress can do nothing about that. However, when the NEA, the National Emergencies Act, was passed into law, a check was built into it. The House and the Senate can take up what is called a joint resolution for termination, meaning if they feel the president is acting irresponsibly or if the threat that brought about the national emergency has dissipated, they can halt the president's actions. And both houses of Congress have to vote on this, no matter the makeup of Congress. Like, for example, right now you have a Republican majority in the Senate and a Democrat majority in the House of Representatives, but that doesn't matter. Both houses will have to vote. The way it works is one chamber votes, and then the other has to hold a vote within 18 days. For this situation, the House could easily vote to halt the national emergency action. The Democrats hold the majority, and you would even see some Republicans be on board with this. I can think of two off the top of my head that I am confident would be on board with siding with the Democrats: Justin Amash and Thomas Massie. But it is difficult to see the Senate doing this. Some Republicans, like Rand Paul and Mike Lee, oppose Trump's actions declaring a national emergency. The Republicans hold the majority in the Senate, but I don't think there would be enough Republicans who would vote with the Democrats on this. But let's say that both houses of Congress did vote to halt the president's actions. Then what? We're not done yet. Like any other legislation passed by Congress, the president would need to sign off on this. Now, this might sound silly because this would be the president would technically be halting himself. But thanks to a Supreme Court ruling from 1983, this is the way it has to be done. For reference, the case is INS versus Shutdown. The Supreme Court ruled that for a congressional action to take legal effect, it must be presented to the president for signature or for veto. I think it's safe to say that President Trump would not veto this. That he would veto this. Congress would then need a supermajority in both houses to override the veto. There's a process that needs to be followed. The process ends with the president proceeding as planned. You know, Trump has his reasoning for wanting a border wall. I don't think placing a barrier at the border entirely solves the problem. It doesn't do anything to fix the immigration process itself. The immigration process in this country is severely flawed. It's expensive. It's riddled with bureaucracy. I personally think the length of the process is entirely too long. Does it really need to take 7 years? The process is difficult, and for a poor person who flees their homeland in search of a better life, it's understandable why they would bypass that and enter the country illegally. And, you know, not every illegal immigrant was a criminal before illegally crossing the border. With all the fighting the two parties do over the immigration issue, neither has proposed fixing the process. Instead, they sling mud at each other while rallying their respective supporters. They do this with almost every issue in this country. We'll watch and see how this plays out. My prediction is that Democrats in Congress will file a lawsuit, and that will slow this down. If Trump wins re-election and if the lawsuit is not successful, he will proceed as planned with the national emergency. That is, if he doesn't have the funding from Congress by then. This could make its way to the Supreme Court before it's said and done. The president has already appointed 2 justices, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. Both are textualists, and both are believed to base their opinions only on what the law says. As it stands right now, we know that there are 4 justices on the court that would vote to uphold the lawsuit. As for the other 5, I don't really know. Elsewhere, Amazon broke up with New York City on Valentine's Day. I wrote about an article on this entitled "Amazon Breaks Up with New York City." You can find this article on beinglibertarian.com. Amazon announced back in November that it had plans to build a second headquarters in Queens, and the company had reached an agreement with New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio that it would have given Amazon $3 billion in tax breaks. In exchange, Amazon would bring 25,000 new jobs to the area, as well as a projected $27.5 billion in tax revenue over the next 10 years. But this is not happening now. Instead, Amazon will take no new jobs to New York City, and the city will not receive that $27.5 billion in tax revenue. Local and federal lawmakers, along with labor unions, managed to drive Amazon away. Great job, folks. Amazon released a statement on February 14th saying that after much thought and deliberation, they decided not to move forward with their plans. While polls showed that 70% of New Yorkers support our plans and investment, a number of state and local politicians have made it clear that they oppose our presence and will not work with us to build the types of relationships that are required to go forward with the project we and many others envisioned in Long Island City, the statement said. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been one of the biggest critics of the second headquarters. She began tweeting about it back in November when the announcement was made. Other critics are with the New York City Council. Ocasio-Cortez tweeted last November that Amazon is a billion-dollar company and that the idea that it will receive hundreds of millions of dollars in tax breaks at a time when our subway is crumbling and our communities need more investment, not less, is extremely concerning to residents. And I have trouble understanding her logic here. Yes, you're giving Amazon tax breaks, but 25,000 new jobs means more tax revenue. Giving Amazon tax breaks doesn't mean that New York City will come away with nothing. But now that Amazon isn't following through with the project, now New York City will come away with nothing. I also don't get why AOC is saying that New York City would be subsidizing those 25,000 jobs. Amazon wasn't going to receive subsidies from the city. They were going to receive tax incentives. A tax incentive is not the same as a subsidy. She's wrong on this. And she's so wrong that even MSNBC called her out on it. If anyone is still wondering how she became a congresswoman, there's your answer. Amazon said it has no new plans to find a new location, although they have received invites. Lindsey Graham invited them to South Carolina. Democratic Congresswoman Frederica Wilson invited them to Florida, but they are not invited to New York City, although that is not entirely true because people in New York City were upset over the decision. And Quinnipiac University conducted a poll that showed a 56% approval rating for the second headquarters. It was the minority that drove Amazon away. I did not know democracy worked like that. Everyone is going to continue to watch what happens with this national emergency. There's going to be a fight, and yes, there will be a fight, and it's just a matter of how this all plays out. We'll be watching and we'll see what happens with this. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Political Circus Weekly podcast. I'll be back next week, and maybe we'll know what's going on with Ruth Bader Ginsberg. This is like the new version of Where is Carmen Sandiego? Thank you for listening. I will see you all again next week.